posted on our YouTube page, which you can find on the Crested Butte Museum website.
A little closer and louder.
Yep. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us in our fourth installment of Crested Butte History with Dr. Dwayne Vandenbush. My name is Remy Schultz, and I'm the registrar at Crested Butte Museum. I'll start the evening by giving a land acknowledgement. So the museum recognizes that we are guests here on this land, which is historically Ute territory. We acknowledge that the Uncompadre Ute and the Tabawash Ute were forcibly removed from this area due to the Bruneau Treaty. We hope that you will take the time to visit our neighbor, the Ute Museum, located in Montrose, Colorado. While we can never do this history justice, we do include information about Paleo Indians of the Gunnison Valley, the Ute people, the Bruneau Treaty, and the Los Pinos Indian Agency in our exhibits. Other ways to support Indigenous peoples of today and the past is to go beyond land acknowledgements. So please consider taking steps towards allyship and reconciliation by conducting your own research of Indigenous groups that were forcibly removed from your own community, by visiting local Indigenous museums and cultural centers, and reading literature from Indigenous writers. We hope that you will consider becoming members of the museum or making a donation to support this program and all the work we do here at the museum. And you can do that by visiting our website at crestedbuttemuseum.org. The museum is currently open from 11 to 5 during the week and 11 to 6 on weekends. And we have several events coming up, which Dwayne touched on. So please join us every Friday at 10 a.m. at the museum for a 45-minute interpretive tour inside the museum. And you can learn about Tony's Conoco, old timers, and an in-depth look into our current exhibits. You can also join us March 2nd, where we are starting our CB walking tours every Wednesday at 2 p.m. with Lo Cunningham. March 11th and 12th, we are putting on the play Let 'em Run, the Great Ski Race of 1866, which is a Reader's Theater production. And March 16th is the polka party with Pete Dunda and Dwayne Vandenbush. And that'll be live streamed and there's free beer, so you better make it out. March 18th, we are hosting a night at the museum. And so you can come join us here with 2 historians and take a closer look into our collections and stories. Highly recommend it. March 30th at 5:30 p.m. Is Paul Anderson's book signing. It's his book, The Town That Said Hell No, Crested Butte Fights a Mine to Save Its Soul. So it'll be a presentation and there's complimentary drinks. And then April 2nd, we are hosting another pub crawl. This one will be a little bit different as we are calling it our Gaper Day Pub Crawl. Come celebrate the end of the season with us at Cochevers, the Eldo, and the Talk of the Town with past instructors, patrollers, and Flauschink has-beens. Then meet us at the Talk after a concert with alternative people. All proceeds benefit the museum. This program is being recorded and will be available at crestedbuttemuseum.com and on our YouTube page, which you can find on our website. If you have any questions about our programming, visit crestedbuttemuseum.com. You can find us on Facebook or Instagram, and you can sign up for our newsletter as well. We will also always list our events in the newspaper. Thank you to our lead sponsors, Diane Woolery in honor of John Yankovich, John Briggs Construction, and Cochevers. We'll have time for questions at the end of the talk, and please post those in the chat for the Q&A. You can also answer your trivia question in the chat for the Q&A. Thank you to everyone who has attended, and a huge thank you to our lead sponsors, Diane Woolery in honor of John Yankovich, John Briggs Construction, and Cochevers. Without our sponsors, we could not provide this series and your generous donations. Take it over, Dwayne.
All right, thank you very much, Remy. I want to thank our sponsors also, and I want to put a real plug in next week for Pete Dunda and the Polka Party. Pete's going to talk about the early history of Crested Butte, the music of Crested Butte for about 15 minutes, and then it is polka time starting at 6:15 with free beer. We're a nonprofit, so we can't sell beer, so free beer. It ought to bring a crowd in. We'll have a trivia question at the end for one of my books, and first come, first serve. Today, we're going to talk about Crested Butte as a great coal town. So I'll start off by saying this. Crested Butte, 8,885 feet. That's the last one that we're going to put down. Yeah, we'll just hold off on that for a moment. Crested Butte, 8,885 feet high. 6 mountains, 14,000 feet or better between it and Aspen, one of the most beautiful places in the world. And it's right at the junction of Coal Creek and the Slate River. And there you get a good look at it in 1884 with the Elk Mountain House, later on Donita's on the left, You got a unpaved road. You got, it looks like a little irrigation ditch or water on the right, and you're looking west down beautiful Elk Avenue. I'm going to start off with a little story. When I first came to Colorado, I was hired as a professor at Western State in 1962, had never been here, didn't know anybody, been hired over the phone, got a one-room house in Gunnison, and decided that I would drive up and see this little town called Crested Butte and maybe have a glass of beer. Now, I grew up in a Belgian farming community called St. Nicholas at the north end of Lake Michigan in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. My dad and grandfather were both off the boat. They were born in Belgium in Antwerp. So everybody I grew up with in that Belgian farming community spoke in a foreign language, Flemish or Walloon or Dutch, or they talked in a clipped accent. So I drive 28 miles up to Crested Butte, and I meet some of the people here, and everybody is talking in a foreign language or clipped accent. And I remember saying to myself, Vandenbush, you are home. And it's been my home for the last 60 years. The original residents in this area were the Ute Indians, and they were all over the East River Valley along the Slate River, and ultimately, because of the mining boom, were moved out in the year 1875 and moved out to Kelowna, which is a little south of Montrose, and then eventually out of Colorado completely, except for the southern Utes in the year 1880. And then that opened the area up for placer miners to come in. And they came in looking for free gold with gold pans. And by free gold, I mean shot wire, grain flour, dust, nugget, put in your saddlebags, as we talked about last time, and ride away. Minersville, 7 miles from Crested Butte, up at the head of Washington Gulch, 250 people. All kinds of people along Rock Creek, later on called the Crystal River. Schofield Park, East River, Slate River, the placer miners were everywhere. Probably about 500 of them in this area, and they turned out $3 to $6 million worth of gold when gold was selling at 20 an ounce. It's now selling at about $1,900 an ounce, so do the math. And then we talked last time about the great surveyor, Ferdinand Vanderveer Hayden, who came here as part of the great surveys of the American West, a scientific look at the West. And standing on Mount Teocalli, he saw those two great mountains in the distance, named them the Crested Buttes. As I mentioned last time, later on, they thought one more resembled a Gothic cathedral, hence the name Gothic Mountain. They dropped the S off of Crested Buttes, and it became known as Crested Butte Mountain, crest of a Spanish helmet. Two brothers named Jennings discovered coal deposits along Coal Creek in 1875. They soon sold their coal land to the two fathers, really, of Crested Butte, Howard Smith and Sant Richardson, 3 years later. And those are the individuals that began the coal development in the East River Valley. Crested Butte, however, first came to prominence as the gateway to the Elks, the supply town, the railroad town, the smelter town for the great silver camps which surrounded it, Gothic and Irwin, Tin Cup and Schofield, Crystal and Pittsburgh and Elko. A pioneer wagon road was built in 1880 between booming Irwin, 10 miles to the west, and Crested Butte. Today, you can get on that road and ride your mountain bike for about 7 miles. There were two routes into Crested Butte before the arrival of the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad in 1881. One came from Gunnison, went through Almont, where there was a toll bridge over the Taylor River, and then went up to Jack's Cabin and Glacier and on into Crested Butte. And Barlow and Sanderson was the major stage line that ran along that route. The other route, the major route coming into Crested Butte, really ran over the Ohio Creek area, up over Ohio Pass at 10,033 feet, and then hitting the Pioneer Wagon Road and getting into Crested Butte. A red letter day in the history of Crested Butte came on November the 21st, 1881, when the Denver and Rio Grande Narrow Gauge Railroad, which had built into Gunnison on August the 6th, ran 28 miles up to Crested Butte and arrived here on November the 21st, 1881, in anticipation of getting silver out and anticipation of getting coal out. And a railroad really made Crested Butte in the early days. Crested Butte got its first saloon in 1879. The newspaper account said there were 3 pine trees where freight wagons unloaded. One was cut down and split to make a bar. Freighters pulled a barrel of whiskey off the wagon, and with each man having his own can to drink from, paid 25 cents a drink. And right around that area you're looking at right now, Elk Avenue. The Elk Mountain House on Elk Avenue, where Donita's later stood, was the great hotel of Crested Butte. It was the town's answer to Gunnison's famous La Vita Hotel. It was finished in 1881, had a grand opening in February of 82 that included 150 guests coming to a grand ball and supper. There were 86 different foods on the menu. It took a year and a half to build that hotel, which was 34 by 100 feet. It had a big stove in the center of the main floor, which heated the halls above by registers. The dining room was 34 by 36 feet, and 2 rooms on the 3rd floor made up the bridal chamber. The Elk Mountain had 42 rooms, was 3 stories high, and had a pool room, and was built for $40,000 by Crested Butte town father Howard Smith. And there is a great look at that great Elk Mountain house, later Donita's, right on Elk Avenue, and you see Gibson Ridge in the background. 3 other hotels came in Crested Butte, all in 1881 and all along Elk Avenue. The Forest Queen, which is still there today, the Crested Butte House, and Mrs. John Sanger's house. Crested Butte got a school early. The first one was a frame building above the coke ovens just to the south of town. And this wasn't a good location because of the fumes and the smoke from the coke ovens. And as a result, another frame building came on the other side of town. In 1883, the Old Rock Schoolhouse was built. It's still there today. The frame building was then used for the grade school and the rock building for the high school. And the nickname of all Crested Butte athletic teams at that time were the Rangers. By 1916, Crested Butte had the largest school population in the county, bigger than that even of Gunnison. In 1881, Coal Creek, 2 miles above town, was tapped for water, and a reservoir was built on a hill west of town. Still there today, still helping to provide water. In 1882, a telephone line connected Crested Butte and Gunnison. And 7 years later, in 1889, the Crested Butte Light and Power Company was started and provided electricity to the town. Direct current, Thomas Edison's direct current. Louis Barthel was the mail carrier in Crested Butte. He carried mail along a toll road between Crested Butte and Gothic along the East River, winter and summer. There's a famous story about Barthel having to carry a 10-gallon can of coal oil in for a miner in Gothic. It was pretty tough when you're on skis putting it on your back. So when the guy in Gothic who had ordered the coal oil ordered a pair of hip boots so he could stay out of the water in the Sylvanite mine, Louis Barthel brought him in the next time, one at a time. Louis getting even with the guy who ordered the can of coal oil. East Maroon Pass. As you go from Crested Butte to Gothic, which is 8 miles, you're going to hang a right-hand turn and go up Copper Creek. And then at the head of Copper Creek is Copper Lake, and you're going to go over East Maroon Pass at 11,800 feet and drop down East Maroon Creek and on into Aspen. Now, why was that important? It was important because Aspen, the #1 silver town in the world, did not get a railroad until late 1887. And that involved necessitating 400 to 500 burros, or Rocky Mountain Canaries, they were called, because whenever they got more than 200 pounds of something on their back, they wouldn't move. They just sit down, and they brayed like a canary, shrill whistle like a canary. Hence, a burro was called a Rocky Mountain Canary. A dinner station was built at Copper Lake, along with stables and a small boarding house. A mail route also came, and a road was finished, and a passenger and mail stage came. In the winter, bobsleds and sleighs were used. You left Crested Butte at 8 a.m. in the morning, and you got to Aspen at 4 p.m. Avalanches were many. And as a matter of fact, They were very dangerous, killing 6 in one slide, and they killed the mail carrier A.C. Adair in another in 1885. His body wasn't found until the spring. But that route was used by the Burros carrying aspen ore over East Maroon Pass through Gothic and then to the railhead at Crested Butte. And then the Burros were reloaded with 200 pounds of supplies and taken back the same way to bring those supplies into Aspen. A primitive road was also built up Brush Creek and 8 miles into Aspen, the last 8 miles into Aspen from the top of Pearl Pass. Pearl Pass was 12,075 feet high and very difficult. The Crested Butte newspaper said, and I quote, "The last 8 miles into Aspen will require much work, as the builders of the road did not follow the route of the engineers and ran over hills and boulders, making it impossible for teams." The main avenue in Crested Butte in 1881 was not Elk Avenue, the current main drag today. It was Maroon Avenue, but the arrival of the Denver and Rio Grande changed it to Elk. In the center of town, 4 blocks were laid out. In the plan, they had a plaza, and the plaza was located in the form of a diamond, in the center of which was a flagstaff. The plaza was to have 3 artificial lakes along with shade trees, evergreens, and shrubbery. None of that ever happened. Fires were always a big problem in Crested Butte, primarily because buildings were made out of wood, they were very close together, and there was little fire protection, especially in the winter. And on top of that, you usually had a lot of gas or blasting powder in the buildings. An 1890 fire came with a high wind and burned 15 buildings along Elk Avenue at a cost of $50,000. Now that's $50,000 then. Just imagine what that'd be worth today. After that fire, hydrants were installed. But in 1893, another fire came on Elk Avenue, and the water was frozen in the hydrants. Keep that there just for a second, if you would. And that is the fire of 1893, where they decided, because the wind was blowing, they'd better blow up a couple of buildings to keep the fire from spreading on Elk Avenue. What they didn't realize is that the 2 buildings they blew up had dynamite and blasting powder in them. And as a result, they knocked down 4 other buildings and drove a gaping hole through the fire hall, which is still in Crested Butte today, right across from Cochevers. Now we go to the next one. There was another fire that occurred right on the bench, and that one burned down a number of buildings that existed for the big mine. There is a shot of the big mine that is being built. More about that later on. That would be the 3rd largest coal mine in the history of Colorado, and we'll talk about that in a minute or two. 2 fantastic railroads were produced around Crested Butte in the 1880s. One of them was proposed in the 1880s to connect Crested Butte with Marble. Now, if you follow me, this road was going to go from Carbondale up the Crystal River to the town of Marble, then to the marble quarries, then over 12,200 foot high Ewell Pass, then down the Slate River Canyon, and all the way into Crested Butte, where it would hit a railhead. That was called the Elk Mountain Railroad. Now, anybody who's ever walked that area over Ewell Pass into Marble knows that would have been one unbelievable railroad and probably impossible to build. Another railroad was planned as Aspen, and that one would have run from Crested Butte over Pearl Pass or from Almont through Taylor Park, over Taylor Pass at 11,800 feet, down Express Creek into Ashcroft, and then Aspen. They were very optimistic in those days. In 1894, the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company big mine opened up on the bench. There's another example of the explosion that drove a hole through the fire hall in 1893. The big mine, which we're going to get into extensively in a little bit later, would produce coal for the next 58 years. Didn't close till 1952. Colorado's 3rd largest mine. 7 miles of underground tunnels, a bituminous mine. 400 men worked there, 70 mules worked there, and the big mine was the dominant force in Crested Butte for a long time. Below the big mine entrance were 154 coke ovens, which produced coking coal, essential in the production of steel. And there you get a great look at the coke ovens with the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad right alongside of it, which would pick up that coking coal and take it to the CF&I steel mills in Pueblo. Now, you need 3 or 4 things to produce steel. And remember, you only had iron in the early days, and iron was easily breakable, especially in cold temperatures. So to power the U.S. Industrial Revolution, you had to have steel. So to produce steel, coking coal from Crested Butte. We'll talk about that in a second or two. That went by rail to the CF&I steel mills in Pueblo. On the east side of Monarch Pass, you had a big limestone quarry. It still produces in the summer today, owned by the CF&I. You need lime to make steel. And then you got iron from Trinidad. And then from my neck of the woods, there's another picture of the coke ovens. From my neck of the woods in Upper Michigan, I grew up in the iron country and the copper country with towns with names like Iron River, Ironwood, Iron Mountain, Calumet, and Bessemer. And in 1856, Henry Bessemer of England invented the blast furnace. So you put coking coal, limestone, iron in a blast furnace. You blast air into the furnace, driving more of the impurities out, and what you have then is steel. So Crested Butte, very important in the production of steel very early in the history of the Industrial Revolution. So there is Crested Butte. By 1882, Crested Butte had 1,000 people. By 1890, it had 1,500 people. The town soon got 3 newspapers. The Crested Butte Republican in 1881, replaced by the Crested Butte Gazette in 1883. And then John E. Phillips, the famous Elk Mountain pilot in Irwin, moved the Elk Mountain pilot to Crested Butte from Irwin in 1884. And finally, the Crested Butte Weekly Citizen, started by a very controversial woman editor named Sylvia Smith. We'll talk about her later on. She later on became famous in Marble, and her paper began in 1900. From 1894 to 1952, when it closed, the CF&I Big Mine on the Bench was Crested Butte's largest employer and Colorado's 3rd largest coal mine. Crested Butte's coal mines, which we're going to get into in a little bit, produced anthracite, which is hard coal, bituminous soft coal, and coking coal, and was one of the top coal towns in the West. Then, in 1952, because of oil and gas and high transportation costs, the big mine closed and Crested Butte's population plummeted to 300, and many said it would become a ghost town. In 1955, the Rio Grande took out the railroad tracks, and the end seemed near for the once great mining town. 12 years later, incidentally, they lost their school, which fortunately revived again about 32 years later as one of the best in the state right now. The Keystone Mine, just west of town by about 2 miles, which had always produced silver, lead, and zinc as early as 1881, reopened in 1957, hoping to replace the big mine. And it worked on and off for 15 years, but it never amounted to much. Few knew it at the time, but that mine, located on Mount Emmons and near Red Lady Basin, was in the middle of one of the largest and richest molybdenum deposits in the world. In 1958, 6 years after the big mine closed, Dr. Hubert Smith, a medical doctor and a lawyer from Texas, started a law science academy in Crested Butte and bought many homes, buying them for $50, $100. He hosted summer institutes for doctors and lawyers to attend with their families. The publicity about the scenery and the outdoors publicized Crested Butte. The town was now starting to become a tourist destination. And the age of coal finally gave way to the age of snow in Crested Butte. when two Kansans, Dick Eflin and Fred Rice, came into town in 1961, and they began the Crested Butte ski area during the winter of 61, 62. And the age of snow now replaced the age of cold. Crested Butte initially was a town first inhabited by cousin Jacks, with names like Gardner and O'Neill and Ross and McCluskey. Of the 61 people killed in the Jokerville Mine explosion, which we'll talk about in a little bit, every one was a cousin Jack. Then in the late 1880s and the 90s, people began to come in from Italy, Slovenia, Slovakia, and Italy and the Austro-Hungarian Empire with strange-sounding names like Sedmak and Sporsic and Saya and Krismanich and Kapushin and Mihelich. And they worked in the coal mines even though they had been farmers when they were out in southeastern Europe. On January 24th, 1884 at 7:30 a.m., the Jokerville explosion came. We'll talk about that in depth in a little bit. That mine had opened just a little west of Crested Butte in 1881 and had 50 coke ovens. The explosion killed 61, the third worst mining disaster ever in Colorado history, and the worst ever at that time, caused by seeping methane gas. In the early years of Crested Butte, the only way to get around in the winter was by skiing. Norwegians and Canadians showed how to ski because they had skied before. The skis were 9 to 14 feet long, 4-inch heel block, leather toe piece, guide pole, and many great ski races occurred in the Gunnison country, one camp against the other. We'll be talking about that a little bit later on in a different episode. As silver faded and finally collapsed with the silver panic of 1893, the silver towns became ghost towns, and Crested Butte turned to its destiny, and that was coal. 9 great coal mines surround the town. The Peanut and the Pershing along the lower loop, the Big Mine on the bench, Floresta, the great anthracite mine 11 miles to the west, the town of Anthracite or Smith Hill, 4 miles north along the Slate River, the Jokerville, which blew up, and then the Pueblo, the Buckley, and the Robinson, 3 bituminous coal mines just to the east of town. Crested Butte was called the Pittsburgh of the West, and the great Horace Tabor of Leadville came into town as majority owner of the bank because of all the optimism. One account of Crested Butte during those days declared, and I'm quoting, "Long banks of coke ovens made the night sky lurid with leaping red flames and the sickening sweet odor of coal being baked onto coke ovens, and that hung heavily over the snow-covered town." So, Crested Butte, Keystone Mine, silver mines, coal mines. And now we're going to take a look at 2 of the greatest of them all. We're going to start off with the ill-fated Jokerville Mine. The Jokerville Mine, as I said, is about 2 miles just to the west, about a quarter of a mile west of town. And it was a bituminous mine connected to the coke ovens by a railroad track. The first coking coal had been done in pits, but by 1883, 50 coke ovens of fire brick encased with stone had been built. By 1884, 30 men were employed by the Colorado Coal and Iron Company at the ovens, and 120 men were working at the Jokerville, 24 hours a day in 3 shifts. The best coking coal in Crested Butte came from the Jokerville. Coal used in the ovens was screen coal or slack with the lump coal loaded on cars for market. Now it is 7:30, January the 24th, 1884. An explosion came in the Jokerville, and that Jokerville killed 61 cousin Jacks, and they were from Germany, Scotland, Wales. And there you got a good look at a Harper's Weekly drawing of the aftermath of the Jokerville mine explosion. The explosion was caused by the seeping methane gas. The 61 men were all killed and were cousin Jacks. Their names were Coughlin, Dunnigan, Maroney, O'Neill, Walsh, McDonald, and Murray. And there's a good shot of the grieving widows. Grieving, 61 men killed. Men working in chambers 1 and 2 were all dead because of the explosion. They were badly mutilated. Others died because the fan providing ventilation was destroyed. One miner named Johnny Cashian led 10 men 1/4 of a mile from inside the mine for 30 minutes to safety. Unbelievable. Another 17 men got to within 200 feet of safety when they collapsed and died because they ran out of air. The Jokerville Mine is only behind the 121 killed in the Hastings Mine outside of Trinidad on April the 27th, 1917. 46 miners were buried 5 days after the blast in a common grave on the northwest side of the Crested Butte Cemetery in 3 feet of snow and in a blizzard. Coroner's report said after 7 days of hearing that the explosion had occurred in Chamber 2, caused by gas seeping and coming into contact with naked light. Professor Arthur Lakes of Colorado School of Mines had said that the Jokerville was very dangerous, and he said this before the explosion. The roof, he said, was poor, and a ticking sound was heard constantly from the escape of gases in the coal. Lakes also said that as mining went deeper, coal gases would increase, and a need for better ventilation would be needed. I'm quoting him now when he said, "Doubtless the coal of this mine contains the greatest amount of dangerous gas in the state." The Colorado Coal and Iron Company, however, chose the jury investigating the mine explosion. John Gallagher had worked in the Jokerville, said that although the fans supplied more air than the law required, much of it escaped up the main shaft before it could be distributed. The CC&I was guilty of gross negligence, and I'll give you about 5 points. The coroner, William Snyder, was an employee of the CC&I. The foreman from the town of Anthracite who removed the dead men condemned the CC&I for negligence, but he was never called as a witness. John Gibson, the foreman, had been only through the mine 6 times in 1 year because he considered it too dangerous. The law requires that 2 entries of a mine be 300 feet apart, but the Jokerville entrances were only 60 feet. And then finally, James Richardson, the superintendent responsible for checking gas, had been fired for neglect of duty a year before by the CC&I, and then rehired a few days before the explosion. The miners who worked at the Jokerville and later on the big mine worked for very, very little in wages. They were paid off in scrip that was good in town, but not good anywhere else. They were forced to live in a company town. You lived in company housing. You bought at the company store. You played at the company playground. Miners from Baldwin and Anthracite came to carry the dead miners out of the Jokerville. 60 miners out of 65 working in Baldwin did not show up for work there. They came to Gunnison and then by train, and they took the miners out. On January the 28th, 4 funerals took place. The Masons buried John Rutherford. The Oddfellows buried 3 men. And then the Protestants had a service. On January the 29th, 1884, 5 days after the mine explosion, 46 miners were buried in a common grave at the Crested Butte Cemetery. Funeral services began at the City Hall in the afternoon. Protestants had a 30-minute service. And then Father John Quinn of the Catholic Church took an hour before a crowded City Hall with people standing outside. At 3 p.m., the procession formed in front of the Elk Mountain House. The order as they moved to the cemetery was sleighs with coffins first, miners in charge of Foreman Gibson second, officers in charge of Sheriff Doc Shores third, and then friends and citizens, and then Father Quinn and the altar boys. The newspaper said, "It is very, very stormy here today, and the ceremonies have been carried out with great difficulty. The snow to the cemetery was 3 feet deep on the level, and no road was broken. Despite this, the citizens of Crested Butte walked to the cemetery. Several of the remains were transferred to the depot to be shipped east. The last two bodies were found on February 2nd. All the bodies had been placed in a blacksmith shop with a cart attached to the breast of each man as he was identified. The Jokerville never reopened. It was allowed to fill with water. Some of the best coking coal in the nation is still there. In 1885, a new opening was made 60 feet above the old vein, but it was still very dangerous, and 10 years later it closed. The Crested Butte newspaper wrote this in honor of the men and where they were, and I'm quoting, "While rising sheer across the sky in all its majesty, defiant of the ages sped, the butte uplifts its crested head. In granite armor strong and gray, a sentinel, it still guards the way. Solemn and still it seems to be, looking in futurity." Most of the men who were killed at the Jokerville mine explosion were single. 6 of them had families living in Crested Butte. Money and food came for widows, including $1,000 from William Jackson Palmer of the CC&I. It was apportioned according to children per family, $65 a head. 2 boys, Tommy Lyle and William Neath, 12 years old, were also killed. They worked as gatekeepers, and Morgan Neath, 17, was a driver. Colonel M.L.D. Corsi, prominent citizen of Crested Butte, was quoted in the Rocky Mountain News as saying, "The mine disaster was a great financial loss to merchants. Plus, it kept other miners from working while cleanup came. Temporary damper on the camp." He wasn't too worried about the dead miners. He was simply worried about finances. The Colorado Coal and Iron Company telegraphed around the country to find the families. One writer to the paper referred to the Jokerville mine as the slaughter pen of the CF&I. We now go to the big mine. And I want to remind everybody, the big mine is on the bench, just south of Crested Butte. Railroad had a water tank, ran right underneath the big mine. And always you had fumes, except on a Monday when women did their washing. So there was a lot of pollution in Crested Butte. The big mine opened in 1894 and closed in 1952. 7 miles of underground trackage, bituminous coal, employed 400 men, and the famous 16-ton song sung by Tennessee Ernie Ford is typical of Crested Butte. And you're looking at the peanut mine right there, which is on the lower loop. I remember Ernie Ford saying, 16 tons, and what do I get? Another day older and deeper in debt. And that was very true. 3rd largest coal mine in Colorado. 70 mules worked in the mine. They cost $200 each. It was said that a dead mule was more important than a dead man because you could replace a dead man, but a mule cost $200. Yearly payroll, $400,000. That was $35,000 a month paid to the 400 men who worked at the big mine. Initial workers have been cousin Jacks, but as I said, after 1890, most came from southeastern Europe. Many deaths came in the mine because of falling rock. Over 100 men died in 58 years. Miners in the 1890s made $3 a day. Those working by the ton made $5 to $6 a day. A fire in 1909 burned the engine house and several outside buildings, and the mine had to close up for 30 days. Same thing happened in 1921. Major vein in the mine was 5.5 to 24 feet thick. That's pretty good. The workings of the mine extended south under a cover of rock 2,000 feet thick. The roof of the mine was shale overlain by massive sandstone. The coal in the big mine was high grade and timbering was used. The method of mining was called room and pillar. Rooms were 25 feet wide and 400 feet long. Ventilation came from an exhaust fans 11 feet by 6 inches in diameter. Explosive gases occurred in some places in the mine and no matches were allowed. Safety lamps were used. The coal was sheared by hand with no shooting allowed because of the danger of explosions. 200 wooden cars of 3,000 pounds capacity were used. From the pit mouth, the coal went by gravity incline to the tipple, which was located so that the coal could be loaded onto railroad cars or sent to coke ovens. And here's another good look at the tipple. Strikes were common. 1891 with Doc Shores, the sheriff of Gunnison, being called in. 1904 with George Bear of the Reading Railroad, who talked about being a Christian man and didn't having a whole lot of support for miners. And then again in 1927. There is a good look at the Horace Mine, just to the south of Crested Butte, with the railroad right below it. And you see where that coal came out of the mine up above, down a tramway, into the tipple, and then loaded onto waiting railroad cars to be taken to Gunnison and then over Marshall Pass to the CF&I steel mills. Strikes in Crested Butte involve wages, hours, safety, but most of all, collective bargaining. The miners wanted collective bargaining. The CF&I, as I said, controlled elections. They used scrip, had company housing. And there with our next one, there's another shot of the coke ovens. And the immigrants were taken advantage of by the people who owned the mine. There is a good look at the company housing that all those coal miners who worked for the CF&I on the bench lived in. And that's in the 1880s. The big mine, as I said, closed in 1952. A couple of interesting little side bits. The Crested Butte School had the only school paper in the state published and printed entirely by students. Rangers were the nickname of the athletic teams. 156 steps took you from the town of Crested Butte up to the big mine where the miners worked. Now, in Pueblo, Colorado, where Ray and Jamie Stepan are, they got the Bessemer Museum. And that is where all the great photos are, and a lot of the information is from the CF&I big mine. There is the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad moving from one track to another right off of the bench. If you look on the left center of the photograph, you can see the tipple of the CF&I big mine. We'll give you a few more pictures now if Remy wants to run through them. Go ahead, Remy. There is the railroad bucking snow with a rotary blade out of Crested Butte heading for Floresta. And there is our final photograph. That is the great CF&I. That's the great Elk Avenue located in Crested Butte. You're looking west. That's Chocolate Peak in the background, and that's Elk Avenue about 1882. Today, Crested Butte is the only Colorado town that changed from being a great coal town to a great ski town. Telluride, Breckenridge, Silverton, and Aspen all were great precious metal towns. Crested Butte was the only great coal town that changed into a ski town. So, Crested Butte, unique because of elevation, unique because of the ethnic people, unique because of the 14,000-foot mountains between Crested Butte and Aspen. Ex-coal town, one of the great mountain bike trails in the nation, series of mountain bike trails and unbelievable beauty. I think we may have that last slide now, Remy. We hit it. And there it is, one of my favorite views of all time. There's Crested Butte in the winter with the Elk Mountains in the background, and it doesn't get much more beautiful than that. So that is it. And now we will prepare for the trivia question for one of my books. And Remy will tell you, first come, first serve, how to get the answer to that trivia question.
That's right. So whoever answers first in the Q&A or the chat box will win a prize. And Dwayne will be the judge of that answer.
Well, okay, here we go. So everybody listen up. This mine that I talked about, 3 miles west of Crested Butte and on the flank of Mount Emmons or Red Lady Basin, was a historic silver mine that everyone hoped would replace the big mine when the big mine closed? It's not the Jokerville. We're still waiting for the answer. This is a silver mine, kind of where the treatment plant is today. Peanut mine, no. Keystone, Bill Grierson. Bill Grierson got the Keystone Mine. Thank you, Bill.
Bill, could you send your info to this chat box?
Bill, have you you've won a book before, haven't you? I'll wait for Bill's response. I believe that he may have won a book before.
He's on it.
And we're looking at Jim Nelson on there with the Horace Mine. Keith Fulmer's got the Keystone Mine. So, Bill, congratulations. Now, before we get off, I want to put in the big plug for next week. Anybody in the Gunnison country, he has both books. So we're going to share with someone else. So we're going to give another trivia question. Bill's going to give it up. So I'm thinking about another trivia question right now. And let's see what I can come up with. I want the name of the 3-story hotel on Elk Avenue that was Crested Butte's answer to the La Vita Hotel. First come, first serve. The name of the hotel in there we go. Jim Nelson gets it. Jim, email the address. Yeah, we got a bunch of people getting the Elk Mountain House. So next week, folks, we got Pete Dunda, one of the great polka band leaders in Colorado. He's going to talk for 10 or 15 minutes on the early history of Crested Butte music, and then we are going to polka, and there is free beer. So bring yourself, bring your date, and come on out here and polka with the group. Are there any other questions now that anyone has or comments? Any questions on the talk today? Yeah, we got a lot of good comments. Thank you very much. Yeah, Keith Fulmer, the way station. Yes. Any other questions that anybody has or any comments? And remember, next week is the big polka party. What is the term cousin jacks? Well, cousin jacks are the people who came from Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England. Whenever anybody was injured or killed in a mine, one of the miners would go up to the boss and say, my cousin Jack can do that. And another cousin Jack, or Protestant of English descent, was on the way. So that's cousin Jack. Any other questions? Yeah, thank you, Mark. Any other questions or comments, folks? How is soil remediated from around town? I didn't know it was remediated from around town. You have to get a little clearer than that, Amy, and your book will be on the way on Monday, incidentally. Any other questions anybody has? It's been great talking with you about the great town of Crested Butte, the great coal town of Crested Butte. And thanks for everybody being on board. Yeah, thank you, Karen. Thank Keith very much. Oh, the coal dust or coke cleanup. Yeah, you know that the slack coal was sold to a smelting company out of Texas. And they took that stuff out of the town of Anthracite up the Slate River, too. And it made Crested Butte quite a bit of money. And as late as 1947, anthracite was being cleaned up. But that's what they did with it. Karen, thank you very much. And thank you very much. Any other questions or comments, everybody? If not, I want to thank Remy for being so good on the photos. And we will see all of you for the polka party and the polka history of music in Crested Butte next week.
Join us next time, too.
Yeah, over and out. Do we get Nelson's address?
Yes.